Go, Jean.
Welcome. I'd like to introduce Ms. Katelyn Heon, who is working and will be finishing her Bachelor of Fine Arts degree this semester. And she will get her degree in ceramics as her emphasis, and her building the figure in clay presentation today. So, Ms. Katelyn Heon.
So hopefully all the media works, because otherwise that might be bad. Oh, where's full screen? Is there a full screen? There we go. Maybe. Awesome. All right, so like Jean said, I'm Katelyn. And this semester and last semester, I've been working on my thesis for graduation. I decided to do a really ambitious project where I decided to create a near life-size self-portrait of myself and then do a bunch of smaller gesture figures in clay. And so in this presentation, I'd like to just show you guys the techniques I use to build these figures, some of my influences for my thesis, and just kind of talk about my work for thesis so far. So that last slide was just some photos of the tools I use to build that big, large figure. And I use a low-fire white-bodied clay. I find that's a lot nicer for me to use than like a red-bodied clay, because you're kind of forced to glaze the entire surface of a darker colored clay as opposed to white. Plus I wanted a white figure, so it didn't make sense to use a dark clay. But here's just some photos of like the base of the figure. You can see I have like these structures holding up the weight. That's because if you don't do that, the clay will collapse in on itself if it's too wet or if it's drying too fast. And so it's kind of this whole balancing act of how much can you build a day, and then how long do you have to wait for it to set up enough before you can put another coil on or another piece. So here I'm scoring the clay, and I've kind of adapted a pinching technique to do my figures. Coil technique wasn't giving me what I wanted, which is where you just roll out a big coil of clay and wrap it around and just kind of build up, kind of like a bird builds a nest. So I decided to kind of like grab clay out of the bag and kind of pinch it into the muscle shape I wanted, and then I would attach it. So here you can see how I had to build this figure in two. This was like 6 or 7 bags of clay, so it's extremely heavy. And it took all semester to build. So I have a trash bag in the middle to keep the clay from drying to each other and sticking. And then I will, once it's dry, pick it up and then move it to the bisque kiln. Unfortunately, I forgot to take photos when I was putting on the arms of this piece, so we're going to kind of skip over that process. But here I am working on the detail of like a ribbon around the side, and that's another photo of how I'm kind of attaching the clay. Since it was so wet, I didn't score all the time. So if it was wet enough, I just kind of like make my coil and do the ribbon and just kind of smooth the clay into itself. And there's the shoulder. In a moment, we'll be looking at the face that I did for this piece, and I had a lot of trouble with it. Propping up the face with broomsticks and sponges is not a good idea, because the janitors come by and they knock it over on accident, and then your face lands on the floor. And then you get a scary call from your professor saying, "Oh my gosh, what happened to the head of your piece?" And then you go, "Oh my gosh, I'm on the other side of town, what happened?" So I rushed over, and thankfully it kind of fell on the side, so I didn't have to completely resculpt it. This is before I attached it. So as opposed to propping it with broom handles the second time, I decided I would be smart and patient, and I would set counterbalance by doing the hair first and building it up to help hold the face backwards so that the gravity wouldn't be working against it so hard. So fortunately that worked, and she has a face now, because that could have been really bad. So the texture I used on the hair was kind of a carryover from what I was doing a couple semesters ago. I really liked how wet the clay was, and I liked to drag my hands and fingers through it and like pinch it and leave like this really coarse kind of sharp feeling. And since I had just permed my hair, it made sense, so it's curly looking. But you have to do that when it's very, very wet, and so sometimes I would like add slip on top of it. So anyway, is set aside for the other half of the semester drying painstakingly, me checking it every day and freaking out because since it was my very first life-size piece, it developed cracks up in the corner, and there was just not, that's just a learning experience. But so after this, I decided, okay, I'm not gonna do full-size figures for my thesis because it takes too long and there's cracking issues, so that's something I'm going to expand into after I leave college. And this is just a quick overview of what a bisque fire is for anyone who's not taken ceramics. A kiln's basically like a giant oven on steroids. It goes up to over 2,000 degrees. So depending on your clay body, you decide the temperature that you want to go to. So for bisque firing, you fire it just enough so that it sinters, which is where the material in the clay kind of comes together and it becomes really porous, but it's no longer something that you can reconstitute back into clay because you've cooked it. So since it's porous, you can apply glaze. Glaze is basically just liquid glass, and we mix it up by ourselves. So there will be a slide where I'm mixing up slip, and it's a very similar process. You measure out your materials, and you add it all together. You add water, and then once it's been sitting for a while, you want to sift it again because the chemicals inside the glaze are going to settle at the bottom, and you need to redistribute them evenly throughout your glaze. So I'm about to paint the inside and outside of this piece. I painted the inside first with the glaze, and then I set it together in the spray booth, and then I sprayed it. And I wish my time-lapse had gone longer because my technology pooped out at me in the middle of it, and I didn't realize, so I had to go back and do a quick thing. But it took a long time to spray that whole entire piece thoroughly. So there's just some pictures of it. Finished with the outer coating of glaze, and then I let it sit 24 hours so that the glaze completely dried before I put it in the kiln again, so that when I fired it, if there was still moisture, it didn't like pop out and make like ugly bubbles or anything on the surface of my piece. So there she is in half, and I'm about to go walk it to the kiln with some help. It's a two-person job. It's really heavy, and the kiln you have to like reach down really far and put something in. This is something so heavy I couldn't do it myself. So since it's a low fire glaze and a low fire clay body, I just go to cone 04, which is just kind of a low range. There's like low, medium, and high. Like a high range would be a porcelain that goes up to like cone 10, and it gets extremely hot, like 2,000 degrees. This one is more lax. It's closer to like 1900-ish. It's like in that area for the cone 04. So it's just a picture of the kiln and how it all operates, and her in there. And so I'm going to close the top, and then it's going to go for about 12 hours. Depending on the size of the kiln, it might not take that long, but since this is a giant electric kiln, it takes about 12 hours for it to hit the temperature I want it to. And that little cone I stuck in there, that's kind of like the off switch. It melts at a certain temperature, and then it like has a little clip that falls, and it shuts the kiln off. So then you wait 30 hours for it to cool completely, because if you pull it out too fast, the glass will crack. So that's her out of the glaze kiln, and I was really excited because this project has taken nearly a year to get it to where it is right now, from drying and just mixing glazes and formulating everything to finish it. So as I said, that was a bit too much of an undertaking for me, so I decided to move in a smaller direction for my thesis so that I could have a broader range of work. So I did gesture drawings of different figures, and I chose my figures through like Cirque du Soleil, all their contortionists and aerialists and acrobats. And I did really quick 20, 30-second sketches of the pose to really capture the motion of the piece and like the weight of it. And then from that gesture drawing, I would draw onto a piece of newspaper, and I would start building the piece. So as it said on the slide before, these are kind of gestures in clay. I'm not spending a whole lot of time on them. Each figure probably takes between 2 to 3 hours of me handling it at the most. And that's extremely fast for a piece to be, a figurative sculptural piece to be taken from stage 1 to, okay, I'm slipping it now with pigment, and I'm going to put it in the kiln, and it's going to go cook and, you know, become vitrified and then become a ceramic piece. So I built them all kind of with the same technique as the larger figure, with pinching the pieces into the shape I want and then sticking them on. And since the clay is so wet, I usually don't have to use watered down clay to attach it like glue. So these time lapses are great. I was like really excited when I found a program to do this because with the photos, you couldn't really see the way the clay relaxes under its weight and the way it moves and how when you touch it, it leaves a lasting impression on that piece, which is part of the reason I love clay, because it leaves your finger marks like really physically on the piece. And when you pick one up, you're feeling what the artist has felt. And I think that's a really nice way to experience art in a very tactile way. This piece was done during 12 Hours of Art, which is an annual art department shindig. It's a lot of fun. We show up at like 6 o'clock in the evening on a Friday, and then we stay until 6 o'clock in the morning, and we have pancakes in the morning. So through this 12 hours, we're all working on our art, and it's a lot of peer review, peer critiquing, seeing what everyone's doing, and it's just a nice way to have a creative outlet. So you're gonna see me pausing and talking to some friends, because like I said, the clay, if it's too wet, especially on this pose with like there's angles and arms jetting out at different angles and stuff, I had to let it sit enough to dry in order to attach another piece to it. So that's me critiquing and talking with some friends and then working on my piece a little more, and then I'd be working on my thesis paper off on the side for the computer for a little bit, and then I'd be going back to the figure. So you can kind of see, this isn't the full 12 hours, obviously, but it's a good portion of that, that experience. And I was just really happy I could capture it like this. So this is a different figure just to show you how I put the heads on. I wish I could have slowed down the time lapse there. So the head is kind of like a separate piece, and so I had to poke a hole through the neck to make sure that that air wasn't caught when I put it in the kiln, because otherwise the air couldn't escape the clay body, and the moisture couldn't escape as well from the clay body when I fired it, and it would have blown up. So this is me mixing some slip. I'm measuring out really accurately on like a little weight, like a postage weight scale, and then I'm adding pigment to it, which is a mason stain. It's a chemical that turns the stain a different, or the slip a different color. So instead of spending a lot of time formulating glazes, which is a bit more complicated because I don't have a big book of glaze recipes, I decided to stick with slips. And here's some test tiles of those. So what I'm doing is just adding pigment to that slip, mixing it up and painting it on the test tile just to cook it and fire it and make sure that's what I want before I put it on my final piece. So once I'm happy with one of them, or several of them, I go ahead and I take that slip that I've marked on the shelf, and I take the figure I want, and I paint that slip over the surface to color it. I have to wait until it dries a little bit before I can flip it over because it's still really sticky, and I don't want my fingerprints to get left in the surface. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing 2 layers of slip. I'm doing a base coat and then an overcoat. So the base coat was like a blue on this piece, and then the exterior was green. And you'll see a picture of it a little later, finished and out of the kiln. And here I'm sketching into the piece. Part of my thesis is visually showing what emotions feel like, particular to me. So I'm choosing these colors based off of a psychological survey, and so that's all my color choice. And then I go in and interpret how I feel those emotions when I do feel them. Like, where do I feel them? How do they run through the body? Kind of, are they a really internal, gouging, painful emotion, or are they kind of an external, nice emotion where the marks would be like nice and light and evenly distributed and just very nice? So now I'm going to talk about my influences. I have 2 in particular, one being Sandy Skoglund. She's an installation artist and a photographer. She takes these huge spaces and she just overwhelms them by painting the entire surface one color, and then usually having a complementary color of the objects interacting with that space. So we have like Revenge of the Goldfish, which is like my favorite installation that she has. The goldfish are all swimming around. And if you've been to the Denver Art Museum, you might have seen Fox Games. That's in their permanent collection, I believe. It's been there ever since I've been there, and I've been there a lot. And then the other is Beth Stitcher. She's a ceramic artist. These sculptures are huge. Like, she's probably about my size, and like figures like the wolves are like enormous. Like, they're like the size of a horse. They're huge. And she hangs these pieces like on the walls, or she bolts them to metal structures. And she's been really influential in the way I've decided to showcase my thesis work. So this is my thesis statement. basically, I'm making an installation that is exploring humanity's emotions and how that's a unifying aspect of humanity is our emotions. That's what we all share together. No matter where we come from, we all feel these emotions. So the idea is to convey these emotions without words. I want to visually show people like the physical connections between their emotions and themselves, emotions and humanity. So what I've done is I've taken the Munsell color system, which is part of that psychological survey I was telling you about. They asked 98 students in Alabama, college students, to kind of list what emotions they associate with colors. So every time someone said, I gave it a number, and then I just made this table, so it's a lot easier to look at. But there's like 15, something like that, colors. And so basically what I've done with my colors is I'm like, okay, I have this emotion envy. Like, what does that feel like? Part of it is green is really associated with envy. So I did green on the top because I think that would help identify that emotion better. This is just a shot of the underglaze and the overglaze and how they kind of interact with each other. Like the underglaze will show through. And that's the full piece. These are kind of, they're about roughly kind of that size, these figures. They don't get longer than 22 inches in any dimension to kind of give you an idea of how large they are. And I'm hanging them from chiffon, which is a fabric that a lot of people use for like wedding dresses or window treatments. It's a very sheer fabric. And so you can see kind of here, since it's an installation, I can't take a photo of it because it's not set up yet. I kind of did a sketch of kind of how these emotions are going to be hanging around the figure, how the figure is physically attached to the emotions by sitting on these kind of these strands of connection between the emotions and the figure. And part of the idea is to choose nasty emotions like envy or greed or agony and put those in a place so that when you are going through the installation, you have to like actively avoid those pieces. Like they're going to be in your face, they're going to be in the way, and you need to move around them in order to see the rest of the installation. So, like I said, since I can't have photos of the installation and it's not up, I'd like to encourage everyone, if they're interested, to go to our gallery opening on May 10th. It starts at 5. There's free food. We'll have everything set up. There's a lot of good art and a lot of conversations that you can have dealing with this thesis work. And if there's any questions, I'd like to answer them.